for watching India Global with me, Parmeshwar Baba. Well, they came, they saw, they concurred. The G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi has resulted in major success with the unanimous adoption of the New Delhi Declaration, especially significant as there was little hope of one. We delve deeper into the big outcomes from India's G20 presidency on this edition of India Global. Let's take a quick look at the headlines first. As Italy indicates a rethink on being a part of China's BRI initiative, will the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor project act as a foil to China's BRI that has fueled concerns over Beijing's extensive footprint across at least 3 continents? Well, that's the big question. Russia's President Vladimir Putin praises our Make in India initiative, says Russia can emulate the success stories of its partners like India in promoting the growth of its domestic industries. Floods leave a trail of death and devastation in Libya. At least 10,000 people are missing, while the confirmed death toll has exceeded 5,300 after 2 dams burst over the weekend in the port city of Derna. And the US government has assured a speedy probe into the actions of the Seattle police officer who laughed off the death of Indian student Janvi Kandula after the Indian consulate in Seattle takes up the matter. Our big focus. Now, as Italy indicates a rethink on being a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, will the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor project act as a foil to China's BRI that has fueled concerns over Beijing's extensive footprint across at least 3 continents? Now, there are signs that China is slowing down on their BRI initiative because of its flagging economy. This, as Israel joins hands with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for the historic Middle East corridor, marking another shift in West Asia dynamics. Now, as power dynamics change globally and India emerges as the voice of the global south, we take a closer look at why this corridor is so important.
Ripples of India's G20 presidency. China cornered on its global infrastructure push. Changing power dynamics globally as India emerges as a voice of the global south.
This is a big deal. This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And today I'm proud to announce that we've finalized the historic agreement for a new India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor.
An ambitious and historic plan for a corridor linking Europe, the Middle East and India, announced on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Delhi.
This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr.
Even
Prime
as
Minister.
China looked on.
One
The
family,
Europe-Mid
one
East
future.
India
That's
trade
the
corridor
focus
is
of
part
this,
of a partnership
G20
for
summit.
global infrastructure and investment. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Biden brought together 6 G20 leaders to accelerate investments into high-quality infrastructure projects and the development of economic corridors. Close on the heels of the announcement, Italy reportedly opted out of China's Belt and Road Initiative, sitting face-to-face with Chinese Premier Li Qiang in India, contrasting with Italy's camaraderie with India at the G20 summit. This as Israel joined hands with Saudi Arabia and UAE for the historic India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, marking another shift in West Asia dynamics.
ישראל נמצאת במוקד של פרויקט בינלאומי חסר תקדים, פרויקט שיחבר תשתיות בין אסיה לאירופה. החיבור הזה יגשים חזון רב שנים, שישנה את פני המזרח התיכון, את פניה של ישראל, והוא גם ישפיע על העולם כולו. החזון הזה מתחיל בהודו, עובר דרך איחוד האמירויות, ערב הסעודית, ירדן, ישראל, ומגיע לאירופה.
So why is this corridor so important? To begin with, there will be 2 separate corridors. An east corridor connecting India to West Asia and a northern corridor connecting West Asia to Europe. India, USA, UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, Italy and EU signed the MOU. India will be connected to Europe by a railway line and existing ports through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Israel.
PGII के माध्यम से हम ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर गैप को कम करने में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दे सकते हैं। फ्रेंड्स, भारत कनेक्टिविटी को क्षेत्रीय सीमाओं में नहीं मापता। सभी क्षेत्रों के साथ कनेक्टिविटी बढ़ाना भारत की मुख्य प्राथमिकता है। हमारा मानना है कि कनेक्टिविटी विभिन्न देशों के बीच आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाने का स्रोत है।
Another polar shift, isolating China as Washington and European Union look at India and the developing nations as alternatives to China.
From the launch of a transnational economic corridor to the inclusion of the African Union in G20 presidency, India is putting all efforts to ensure that developing countries are at the center of tomorrow's world. With Shrishti Shankar and camera person Pavan, this is Vasudha Venugopal for NDTV.
Now, while reviewing progress on the India-UK free trade agreement is in the works, the UK has announced that it has agreed on a joint investment package with Tata Steel for the country's largest steel works in Wales, including a grant worth up to £500 million. Now, this is being dubbed one of the largest British government support packages in history and a defining moment for the steel industry too. Now, as part of the agreement, Tata Steel is expected to invest about £1.25 billion, including the government grant, in a new electric arc furnace and related facilities for greener steel production in South Wales, currently the UK's largest single carbon emitter. Why is this such a big deal though? Because without substantial investment, Port Talbot would otherwise be at serious threat, and Tata Steel's operations in the UK, employing about 8,000 people, would be at risk. Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin praised our Make in India policy to promote domestic industries. Speaking on a query made on Russian-manufactured cars, Putin said that domestically manufactured automobiles should be used, and countries like India have already set examples through their policies. With that, let's turn our attention now to the floods that have left a trail of death and devastation in Libya. At least 10,000 people are missing, while the confirmed death toll has exceeded 5,300 after two dams burst over the weekend in the port city of Derna. Many have been buried in mass graves, but one of the chief shortages in the city, apart from drinking water, is body bags required to prevent disease from spreading to unburied bodies. Now, besides building consensus, India's G20 presidency will also be remembered for putting record and finally realistic numbers on the funds that developing nations should receive to fight mounting climate change challenges. Now, the New Delhi Leaders Declaration acknowledges that the developing world will need $5.9 trillion till 2030 for its nationally determined contributions and an additional $4 trillion each year for clean energy technologies to meet zero emission goals. That's a whopping $34 trillion by 2030, more than the GDP of $25.6 trillion reported by the world's largest economy, the United States, last year. This clearly raises the stakes for when these same national players meet again to negotiate at the COP28 in Dubai. Now, going by the G20 declaration, finance will be the key issue. And joining us on the show, the head of climate ambition initiatives at the World Economic Forum, Pim Valdre, for a deep dive into the climate agenda that's been set at the G20 in New Delhi. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us on NDTV. Now, the Mediterranean storm that dumped torrential rain on the Libyan coast, that's believed to have killed thousands of people, and it's the latest extreme weather event to carry some of the hallmarks of climate change. As far as the G20 is concerned, we've seen the move as far as the language of finance is concerned from billions to trillions. It makes an effort to shift the discourse from mitigation only finance to even resilience and adaptation. But for you, what have been some significant takeaways?
I think it's important to remember that the G20 economies produce more than 80% of global greenhouse emissions. So it's really critical that this group shows leadership and sets consistent policies that can drive the climate agenda forward. Now, the G20 declaration this year, I think, produced three key wins for the nature and climate agenda. The first was the agreement to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, and also reiterating the $4 trillion investment needed per year in clean energy by 2030. And the second was the target to double the rate of energy efficiency improvement. And this is really key. The International Energy Agency has predicted that efficiency improvements can drive more than 40% of the emissions cuts we need to see in the next 20 years. But the third outcome, and perhaps the more important one, was that for the first time in G20 history, the declaration put a number on the need for climate finance for developing countries, making clear that, as you said, between $5.8 and $5.9 trillion will be needed for developing countries to reach their net zero targets. And this is really a significant scale up from the original $100 billion per year target that was promised by developing countries almost 10 years ago in Copenhagen at COP15. For sure, climate finance is going to continue to be a topic of interest and of much debate at the upcoming COP28 negotiations in UAE later this year.
Right, but there's been no new language from the last G20 on efforts to phase down coal. It's actually maintained the status quo, as you've probably noticed as well. You know what remains appalling to me is that the G20 accounts for 93% of the world's operating coal plants. So despite the advances at the G20 in New Delhi, do you believe there was a lack of initiative as far as pushing the members on commitments to cut use of fossil fuels and end construction of new coal power plants is concerned?
It's true. The G20 statement didn't advance any new language on the transition away from the use of coal. And as you said, the G20 is home to over 90% of operating coal power and a majority of the newly planned coal power plants. However, I should say that while we need clear policy and regulations for phasing out coal, we should not forget that this needs to be scaled up aggressively with investments into renewable power so that we avoid any future energy shortages. And we also need to factor in the local economy and livelihoods and the need for a just transition here to offer support for workers in these sectors by upskilling and reskilling. So there's a lot of progress we need to see. And I agree with you, there needs to be more progress and advancements in declarations like these if we are to be credible on this agenda.
Right. The key is to deliver tangible progress in terms of transparency, timelines, as well as subsidies reduction as well. But, you know, Ms. Valerie, about the Global Biofuel Alliance, is it good news for some agricultural economies? Is it likely to push farmers to produce more crops that support ethanol and similar biofuels? In a sense, then, diverting farmland away from pure food production and affecting food security?
So the Global Biofuel Alliance that was launched at this G20 with India, US, and Brazil really aims to provide a collaborative platform for nations to exchange best practices and accelerate technology development and bolster solutions on how to scale biofuels. And I do believe that the best practice efforts of this should also look into how to mitigate any side effects and impacts on food production and on food prices, since we've seen that additional biofuel production has in the past had some linkages to spiking food prices. So that is something that will be important to consider as this initiative moves forward.
Right, and ahead of COP28, the G20's Delhi Declaration has asked for $34 trillion to fight this war against climate change. Now, as with all negotiations, you think the starting figure may drop in practice?
Well, I think it's important that we start with a high ambition, and that's why I think this initiative by India is welcome. For sure, the climate finance will be one of the top priorities and top issues for the upcoming COP28 negotiations. We, of course, also have on the agenda the loss and damage fund. This is absolutely critical. You mentioned Libya at the outset of your intervention. We see more and more the impact of climate. It's happening here and now, and we need to advance the modalities and the details of this loss and damage fund. So I believe that the climate finance and coming to agreements on that is going to be absolutely critical for building trust and for advancing other important areas on the global climate agenda at COP28.
Well, thank you so much, Pim Valerie, for joining us on NDTV. It's been a pleasure to get your insight. So as we've noticed, for the past 15 years, G20 leaders have consistently reiterated their commitment to reforming fossil fuel subsidies, but failed to deliver so far. Here's hoping that there are better days that lie ahead of us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
In other news, with Tharman Shanmugaratnam taking oath as Singapore's 9th president, He now joins a long list of Indian origin leaders who are dominating global politics. Here's his story.
I, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, having been elected President of the Republic of Singapore.
After facing stiff competition in a three-way contest, Indian origin politician and former member of Singapore's ruling party, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, has been sworn in as the President of Singapore days after he was overwhelmingly elected as the 9th head of state of the country. While a predominantly Chinese society has overwhelmingly endorsed Tharman, who has served Singapore all his life in public service, about 76% of overseas Singaporeans voted for him too. Besides helping to helm Singapore's political leadership as Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, the former economist has also held top council positions at global institutions such as the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. At one point, he was even tipped to head the IMF. Prime Minister Modi has said he looks forward to working closely with him to further strengthen the India-Singapore strategic partnership. Now, although Singapore has had non-Chinese presidents in the past, Tharman is the first one voted in by the public. He assumes his role at a crucial juncture, with Singapore citizens grappling with rising living costs and expensive housing. Tharman Shanmugaratnam is now among the Indian origin world leaders in political high ranks, apart from Rishi Sunak, Kamala Harris,
my uncles, my aunts and my chitti,
Leo Varadkar and Prithviraj Singh Rupan. Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has assured our government of a quick investigation into the death of Indian student Janvi Kandula in Seattle after being struck by a speeding police patrol car and bringing to justice the police officers who were responsible for this shocking incident.
The US government has assured a speedy probe into the actions of the Seattle police officer who laughed off the death of Indian student Janvi Kandula.
But she is dead.
And whose disturbing comments went viral upon the release of footage from his body cam from the night of her death.
$11,000. She was 26 anyway. She had limited value.
The US government has swung into action after India's ambassador to the United States raised the issue to Washington, demanding an investigation into the mishandling of the student's death. It's not just the Indian government protesting. The incident has garnered responses from US lawmakers too, with many of them raising the question of the value of Indian lives, and others asking the cop involved to take accountability. Political leaders back home in India too have flagged the incident, with BRS leader KTR calling the cop's behavior callous and reprehensible. While the Seattle mayor has written to the family of the student, saying that the attitude of one bad cop is not representative of the entire city, the family continues to grieve, with a statement slamming the police officer's words, saying that Janvi is a beloved daughter and beyond any dollar value for her mother and family, and that every human life is invaluable and should not be belittled, especially during a tragic loss. Nayanthara Singh for NDTV.
While switching tracks, Elon Musk secretly ordered his engineers to disable Starlink satellite communications near the coast of Russian-occupied Crimea last year to sabotage a planned Ukrainian drone strike. This is what an extract from historian Walter Isaacson's upcoming biography Elon Musk asserts. In fact, Musk was worried the drone attack, which was targeted at the Russian naval fleet, would potentially lead to a nuclear war. Here's our report.
4, 3, 2, 1, ignition, and
US Senator Elizabeth Warren has called for an investigation this week following a claim that Tesla and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk curbed a Ukrainian military operation aimed at Russia's Black Sea fleet last year by limiting access to SpaceX's Starlink satellite network. The call for a probe comes after an excerpt was released last week from biographer Walter Isaacson's book titled Elon Musk, in which the author says how a Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian fleet was disrupted last year by a disconnect from Starlink. It's important to note that Russia took control of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and asserts its sovereignty over the region. Reacting to the revelations, Musk said on X that SpaceX did not deactivate anything around Crimea as the Starlink regions in question were already in the deactivated state, adding that they couldn't be activated without explicit US government approval.
At the time this happened, the region around Crimea was actually turned off. Now the reason it was turned off was, actually originally was because the United States has sanctions against Russia, and we're not allowed to actually, and that includes Crimea in the sanctions, and we're not allowed to actually turn on connectivity to a sanctioned country without explicit government approval.
While Ukraine might not have been able to use Starlink satellites for the aforementioned operation, it continues to play an important part in the war. Let us look at why Starlink is crucial to the Ukraine counteroffensive against Russia. Starlink has been instrumental in Ukraine's drone strikes on Russia. Nearly 42,000 Starlink terminals are deployed in Ukraine. Starlink is used by Ukraine's armed forces, hospitals, businesses, aid organizations. Ukraine began using Starlink services shortly after the Russian invasion. Russia had disrupted internet connections when the war began. Internet access was brought to Ukrainian people and military by Starlink. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister has been quoted as saying that the huge number of lives that Starlink has helped save can be measured in the thousands, and that it is one of the fundamental components of Ukraine's success. Interestingly, Russian President Vladimir Putin praised Musk as an outstanding person and talented businessman just days after the claims about Starlink came to light. With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report, NDTV.
That's all that we could pack in this edition. Thank you for investing your time and watching this episode of India Global. Goodbye.